Is damage or pierce better? What is better? So as you see here, I only have 220 damage, but I have 70 pierce. What is better? Having this high pierce and only 220 damage, or being in the middle with like 260 and 45 to 44 to potentially up to 50, or 275 and 40? What is the best? In my opinion, it is my current set. Now, you could make other sets. Like those, what I showed you were other sets I have. I have a up to 70% pierce set that I could go for. But that is only situational. I'll switch to that set if there's a boss that resists a ton. But most bosses do not resist a lot at all. Especially any boss that is behind Arc 4 doesn't really resist at all. Like most enemies don't resist anything. Then you have your occasional storm enemies and bosses that resist usually up to like 45, 50 to 35% resist. But if they're storm, you're usually going to want a prism because there's a lot of bosses that are storm that resist up to 80%. And there's really no situation where you can get up to 80% without sacrificing a lot of damage. So it's just not worth it. So if you are going against a storm boss, you are always going to want to use a prism. You're never really going to want to pierce through it unless it's a low level boss. But nowadays, and even back in the day, like there is some low level bosses that still resist 80% of a certain school. So you're not going to really have a situation where you're going to be able to pierce through all of it. You want to pierce through at least 50% to like 75% of it. But I'd still recommend if it's a storm boss, you probably just want to use a prism. It's just one round and it'll convert your damage to a potential 25% boost. So it's technically like using a balance blade, and you don't have to worry about having pierce at all. For enemies and most bosses that are like not storm, you are going to be piercing through all of their resist. I've had people saying in the comments in my last video saying that, oh, you know, 40% pierce is low, you should go for the 50% 260 damage, and that is also very good, and that is another option. If you don't want to miss out on that 15% damage just for 10% pierce, you know, this is a better option in my opinion, because like I said, most bosses and enemies don't resist 50%. So there's no need to get 50% pierce. So most enemies and bosses, it's better to go with this 15% damage just because you're not going to need to have more than 35% pierce most of the time. So realistically, you only need an average of 35% pierce, since most bosses and enemies resist either 35% or lower. But you'll have your occasional that will resist around 40%, or maybe like 41 or 42%. It's very rare that a boss will resist more than that, so you don't really ever need to go for more than 40% pierce. Unless it is a specific situation, then that's why I say also you should make a pierce set like I have. And that is it's just the same gear, I just have pierce on it instead of damage. Now, I want to make a video about showing you some evidence. I'm not just making up numbers. You could just look at the wiki or even test it for yourself on how much pierce you actually need. I am a human, I promise! Now, Darkmoor has not really been updated for the wiki, but we can look at one of the bosses here that resists 40% to all schools except for death, and it's obviously a death school main boss. So if you're death, you know, you're never really going to be having that much pierce unless you have a pierce set, but I think it's just better to use a prism. It just takes up one round and it's beneficial for you since, you know, you will boost 30% if you do use a prism, so that's a pretty big boost. So definitely use a prism for death, but then what do you do for any other school? And that's why you have that 40% pierce right there. And this is a very rare occurrence for a boss that's not like your school that also resists a good amount. But your 40% pierce will pierce all of the resist, so you don't have to worry about that. In this scenario, you don't need to have that extra 10% pierce since it's just going to be unnecessary. So it'd be better to have 15% extra damage for this current boss. We look at a regular enemy here like the Balk. These are just your average high-level enemies nowadays. They usually resist around this. So this is a death enemy, and it still only resists 29 to 30% resist. So realistically, you only need 30% pierce for this guy, and he only resists 14% for every other school, so you're perfectly clearing out the rest of that resist. Now, this is pretty low for a new enemy. You know, a lot of enemies resist more than this now, so this is not a good example, but showing you that, hey, you usually don't need that much pierce. Now, you will occasionally find a difficult cheating boss that does actually resist a lot of your school, and really every other school, and this is one of them. This guy resists more than what you pierce, but you will be piercing like the majority of it, like 85-90% of it. So it's not, you're not losing that much. You can still do enough damage, and you'll probably just blade up enough and you'll be able to kill him. But even with 50% pierce, you will not be piercing all of his resist. So this is another just situation where you can either just blade up a ton or have like at least 40 to maybe 50% pierce to pierce the majority of his resist. But obviously if you're ice, you're gonna want to prism. But this is just a situation right here, a situationship. So this is another regular enemy, and most enemies do only resist this amount, so you just want to have a little bit over this amount usually. But bosses resist more, so you don't have to worry about your school resisting that much anymore, because you will likely have over 30 to 35% pierce. So sometimes 35% pierce could actually be good too, but the reason why I think 40% is better just because there is a lot more bosses nowadays that resist around 35 to 37, which is the sweet spot. So enemies, you're gonna pierce fine, even with low pierce. Now, there's not much known on Darkmoor yet in terms of the piercing, but I had a perfect time piercing through. Most bosses resist, if not all bosses resist, except for maybe like really difficult cheating bosses, in which they usually resist over 50, like up to 70%. And in that case, what you're gonna do is just blade up a ton, so you can pierce the majority of it. But obviously, if you look at a boss in Wizard101, for example, you look at it as resist. He's a death boss. Obviously, he's going to resist death. You're just going to prism. You're never going to want to hit through your school boss, because, you know, majority of the time they're gonna have more resist than your pierce, even with your best pierce setup. So, like here, for example, this is actually pretty high for a boss in Wizard101, but 32%. Each school. So realistically, you only need 32 pierce to pierce this guy's resist entirely. Ned Colley is another pretty difficult cheating boss right here that resists 37% for every school, and obviously it's a death boss, so it's going to resist majority 6-7% death. So here is the prime example on why I think you need at least 40% or 35% pierce. If you're piercing the majority of it, it's not going to make a huge difference. And if you're piercing all of it, then there you go. You don't even have to worry about the resistance at all. And you'll be piercing through the majority of this boss. You know, Darkmoor is the same exact way, where it's around the same, if not a little bit lower, sometimes higher resist. It's usually up to 40%, and on the very rare of being over 50%. And usually it's like 52% for some reason. That's the sweets. That's usually what they do for, you know, really high resist bosses. Now you have another cheating boss that resists a lot. In this case, they actually do resist 1% more than what you pierce, but obviously that's not going to make a huge difference. But this is showing you that, yeah, you really 40% is around the sweet spot, since you're gonna pierce through the majority of all enemies and bosses, especially, you know, any that are lower than Wizard101 and Darkmoor, because that's where it really got high. Any other world, it was really, you only needed like a little bit of pierce, but nowadays you need a lot more. But I think 40% is the perfect balance for resist, since you're going to resist the majority. And this is like a prime example. I mean, obviously it's 1% off, but that's not going to make a difference at all, really. Here's another example of another boss that resists 36% of every school. So yeah, 40% would perfectly do well here. And this one's even a bit lower. And here you have a perfect 40% where you would pierce all of it for every school except for life. And I believe Darkmoor there's actually surprisingly more bosses that resist less than Wizard101. Now, I assume they're going to only go up, so you're probably going to want to get more pierce eventually. But as of right now, 40% pierce is a perfect balance, since you will be piercing pretty much through every boss's resist, except for the very few. And those very few, you're usually just going to be piercing the majority of it, to where it's not going to make a huge difference. You're still going to be able to do enough damage, especially since you have that 15% extra damage than or more than you would if you went for more pierce. So it basically wouldn't make a huge difference at all. So that's why I think that this is the best base, the best balance for both really high damage, the highest you can get, with also getting pretty good high pierce. 40% to 50% is what you want to be around. And any lower is probably not the best bet, but you want to be around that area. And I think this is just the perfect balance for that. So I think the answer is, I think obviously they both matter, but you want to have a balance. And the main thing that does matter is having high damage with decent to high pierce, but you want to focus mainly on damage, but also getting that pierce at least over the threshold of what, the average enemy and boss resists, which would be, around 25 to 35, and nowadays 40%. So that's why 40% is the perfect base balance for also having max damage. So I think, I've had no problem with Darkmoor with this setup, and I think it's very good. Currently, in my opinion, the best. But it's totally up to you if you want to go for more pierce. It's not going to make a huge difference to go for either set. But yeah, I think this is the best set in the game. But let me know what you guys think down below. And yeah, that's pretty much it. I'm out.